Hello everyone. We are back to history, technique, and also culture tonight. I'm going to tell you about the history of machines, from the earliest, simplest machines that appeared in prehistory to modern computing systems. I'll give you definitions of what machines actually are. We are so surrounded with machines that we don't even think much about them anymore. Just today, for example, you have used a plurality of machines, from appliances in your kitchen, oven, coffee machine, blender or grinder, to vehicles. Cars, trains, planes or boats are also machines. And you are still using machines to listen to me right now. It can be a phone, a tablet or a computer connected to a headset or speakers. The weaving and sewing of the clothes you wear, the metal, the fibers, the wood or the plastic of the objects around you. All of these were extracted and transformed with machines. We kind of live in symbiosis with them. And it could be said that the rise of human technical civilization is, for a part, a rise in the use of machines as extensions of ourselves. Which leads to a questioning. They do a lot for us, but what do they do to us? To our perception of ourselves, to our work, our values, or the things we pay attention to. And this will be our exploration journey for tonight. So make yourself comfortable, we have a lot to discover and think about. Let the tension go in your shoulders, you don't need it. And off we go. To begin with, what is a machine? It is a system that uses power to apply controlled forces and perform an action. Generally, we use the term machine for artificial objects, devices that are relatively complex. They use engines powered by electricity or hydrocarbons that are burnt to release energy. It can be heat or it can be kinetic energy, a blast, like in the internal combustion engines of cars. But the source of power can also be human or animal. For example, if we turn the crank of a coffee grinder, or it can be natural forces such as a wind flow or a water flow in the case of windmills and watermills. Even a simple tool like a hammer can be considered a machine under that definition. A hammer is like a lever powered by our wrist or our arm that transforms the movement we give it at a distance via the handle into a focused force that pushes on the head of a nail. And still under this broad definition, music instruments can be seen as machines. We give them movement or an airflow that they transform into something else, into sound. And this is why, even though we call these very simple machines powered by human movement, tools or instruments rather than machines, they are part of a same continuum. They are objects, systems, created by humans to perform certain tasks when we bring them power. The example of music instruments is interesting, since we use them not for production, but for artistic expression. It shows to what extent machines can become extensions of ourselves. They help materialize our intentions, and maybe they also shape them or influence them, as we also adapt to the machine. It goes both ways. We'll get into this later. So, what are the first machines ever created? To explore them, we can take a look at a group of devices that was defined at the time of the Renaissance, the 6 simple machines. Renaissance scholars had an interest in mechanical devices, which led them to elaborate on the concept of simple machine, a concept that had originated long before, especially with the work of Greek philosopher Archimedes around the 3rd century BC. Archimedes discovered the principle of mechanical advantage in the lever, that is to say, the force amplification achieved by using a tool or a machine. When I say discovered, in fact he formalized the concept, which had been used empirically for thousands of years. This idea of mechanical advantage is just a way of saying that a tool or a machine trades off input forces against movement to obtain an amplification in the output force. Let's take an example. A heavy object may be too heavy to be lifted with our arms, but if we place it on a lever and push downward on this lever from far enough, it becomes way easier to lift. Why is it easier, actually? Because between us and the object there is a pivot, and the object we try to move is closer to the pivot than we are. The velocity of a point farther from the pivot is greater than the velocity of a point near the pivot, so forces applied far from the pivot end up amplified near it. The lever converts speed into force, and vice versa, depending on what we use it for. If we use a claw hammer to pull out a nail, we use the handle as a lever to apply a smaller force over a longer distance, which produces a larger force on the nail over a short distance. And if we use the hammer to hit on a nail and drive it into wood, it is still a lever, one that transforms the motion of our wrist or our arm into speed at the hammerhead. This is the concept of mechanical advantage. And realizing the property of the lever to amplify force, Archimedes came up with this famous remark: "Give me a place to stand on, and I will move the earth." Meaning that theoretically, if the earth was placed on a lever, someone far enough from the pivot, from the balance point, could effectively lift it. The work of Archimedes extended to other simple machines than the lever, machines like pulleys and screws. So, going further on this body of work, the Renaissance period defined 6 simple machines that all are different ways of exploiting this concept of mechanical advantage. The very first type of machine to be invented using mechanical advantage was probably the axe, the hand axe. Prehistoric axes were made by chipping flint to form a wedge, and the wedge is one of the 6 simple machines. Why is that? Because with its triangular shape, like the blade of the axe, the wedge has the property to separate 2 objects or portions of an object, like a tree trunk or a branch. It can also hold an object in place, like these wedges used to keep pieces of wood adjusted, or a door opened. A wedge can also lift up an object if we insert the triangle under it and push. So what a wedge does basically is convert the force applied to its blunt end into forces that are perpendicular to the other end, where the surfaces are inclined. If you insert a wedge, like an axe, into a log, what you do is convert this up and down movement of the axe into perpendicular forces on either side of the blade that separate the log into two pieces. That's the property of the wedge. And an axe basically combines two simple machines, a wedge, which is its blade, and a lever, its handle. The second simple machine to be invented was the ramp, the inclined plane, used to move heavy objects. Ramps are so common and look so passive that we don't think of them as machines, but they are. Because moving an object up an inclined plane requires less force than lifting it straight up. It is not magical. We trade the punctual force needed to lift the object for an increase in the distance moved. In the end, the same work gets done, but with a smaller force exerted over a greater distance. In total, the same mechanical energy is necessary, because there is no free lunch in physics. There is this principle of conservation of energy that I told you about in past episodes, implying that moving an object from point A to point B, if we leave frictions aside, will require a given quantity of energy that cannot be reduced. But an inclined plane makes it way more practical. And this is why from ramps used to load things into trucks, to roads meandering along mountain slopes, or wheelchair ramps, inclined planes are very common. The invention of the inclined plane to move heavy objects also dates back from prehistory. After the wedge and the inclined plane, the following four simple machines seem to have appeared in the ancient Near East, giving important technical edges to the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. First, there is the wheel turning on an axle. The system formed by the wheel and its axle is another simple machine, one that allows easy transportation of heavy objects and other uses such as the potter's wheel, or as a mechanism performing work in more complex machines. In physics terms, the wheel is efficient because it reduces friction. Only a small surface is in contact with the ground at once, and it can be applied movement, momentum, by an external force, like animal traction, or sometimes just a natural water stream and gravity, if you think of water mills. The wheel became ubiquitous thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt as a method to move heavy loads or for the making of vehicles, of chariots. Yet another simple machine that became widely used by these cultures is the lever. As I told you with Archimedes, the lever had this property of trading force for distance. An early illustration of it is the Shuttle mechanism, used in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC and later around 2000 BC in Egypt. The Shuttle is a water lifting device that uses a lever to manually collect water from a river and move it to the bank for irrigation. It is a crane mechanism, a type of machine that quickly became very useful, not only for irrigation, for construction too. A fifth simple machine, also developed in the ancient Near East, is the pulley. That is to say, a system with a cable or a belt passing over a wheel. It changes direction of a force applied to it. In its simplest expression, imagine you need to lift a big stone. If you have nothing but your arms, you need to apply an upward force to it. With a pulley, you can do the opposite. Pull on a rope, or even use your own weight as counterweight, and lift it way more easily. This is what makes pulleys very useful, simple machines. So we have seen 5 different types of simple machines: wedge, inclined plane, wheel and axle, lever, and pulley. There remains one, also an invention of the Middle East, but a later one, the screw. It appeared in Mesopotamia in the first millennium BC during the Neo-Assyrian period. What a screw does is convert rotational motion or force into linear motion or force. Think about what happens when we introduce a screw into wood. We make it rotate, it is a helical structure, and the ridges, the threads around it, make their way into this medium, making the screw descend into it. We give it rotation, and it moves in one direction linearly. A change of direction happens. The screw also amplifies force. A small rotational force on it can exert a large axial force on a load. And this is why screws are so ubiquitous, very convenient. They are in screw tops for containers, screw jacks used to lift vehicles, to change a wheel, for example, or in screw presses. Thanks to screws, a regular person can achieve things like lifting a car that weighs more than a ton. So these are the 6 simple machines, a list formalized in the Renaissance period. To varying degrees they were used during antiquity. Large Egyptian monuments, such as the pyramids, would have been impossible without 3 of them: the inclined plane, the lever, and the wedge, all used to extract and move large stone blocks. These 6 types of devices are not just used independently. More complex mechanical machines actually combine them with gears, wheels, screws, levers that are assembled to perform tasks that require precision, force, or speed that could not be achieved manually, or not without the same yield. One ancient civilization that pushed the study of these simple machines further, beyond their empirical use, is ancient Greece. Starting with Archimedes, Greek scholars defined some simple machines, and were able to roughly calculate their mechanical advantage, the force and the way they transform forces. A limitation of this Greek approach was that it essentially focused on what is called statics, the balance of forces, as opposed to dynamics. What does it mean? Statics and dynamics are two main branches of mechanics, of the study of forces and motion. Statics is the study of things that are either not moving or moving at a constant speed in a straight line, without acceleration or change in direction. The description and the study of forces at play for an object staying where it is, like a bridge holding up cars, a building, or an airplane flying at constant speed and altitude, this belongs to statics. Objects are static when all forces acting on them cancel each other out, so they stay still or follow a same trajectory without alteration. Dynamics is another angle, another way of studying reality. It looks at what happens when these forces become unbalanced, causing acceleration, deceleration, or changes in trajectory. The study and quantification of these situations, when forces become unbalanced, with the trade-offs between force and distance, is somewhat more complicated, and it happened later, after antiquity. The Greeks created more complex machines that used several simple machines to perform tasks, even with a surprising level of ingenuity if you think about the Antiquitera mechanism, an ancient mechanical device that was recovered from a shipwreck. It serves to calculate astronomical positions or eclipses, a type of mechanical computer using dozens of rather precise gear wheels. But on top of the ingenuity, the Greeks also had this analytical approach to many things. They tried to understand how and why things worked the way they did, rather than just use them empirically. And this is why they came up with this first list of individual mechanisms that gave mechanical advantage. The pinnacle of this approach was the work of a Greek mathematician and engineer of the Roman era, Heron of Alexandria. Between other things, he wrote a treatise called Mechanics, in which he listed 5 mechanisms that can set a load in motion. And he invented or described new machines too. A notable one is called the eolipile, also known as Heron's engine, the first steam-powered machine, a kind of steam turbine. It consists in a wheel above a water container, and it is very basic. When the water is heated, the steam that rises above it makes the wheel spin. It is impractical and useless as such. The steam dissipates because it is not contained, and the spinning of the wheel would be way too weak to put a mechanism in action. It is just a curiosity. But technically, it is a steam turbine. Just another example of ingenious devices he elaborated or imagined is the pantograph. A pantograph is a mechanical linkage that reproduces the movement of a pen or a stylus on a different scale. So, for example, you trace an image with a pen connected to it, and a second pen mimics the movement and traces the same image, identical, enlarged or miniaturized, depending on how you set up the pantograph. This principle can serve for duplication in different areas, like engraving, minting, or sculpting. The work of Heron of Alexandria is also the reflection of a late antique world that used a lot more machines, and more complex ones than its predecessors, be it for construction, water management, warfare, or even entertainment. So, what and where were these antique machines? Here are a few standout examples. For water lifting and irrigation, the Greco-Roman world would leave aside the ancient shuttle in favor of devices based on Archimedes' screw. They consisted of a helical screw inside a waterproof cylinder. By rotating the screw with a handle, this would lift water. It is a kind of pump. Connected to a wheel, it could be powered by horses, and this system was used for pumping, for irrigation, as well as draining mines or pumping water out of ships. Cranes also multiplied, used with multi-pulley systems, and powered either by animals or people walking inside trade wheels. That was the preferred method by the Romans to lift massive stone blocks for temples or aqueducts, without having to build large and cumbersome ramps. Through mechanical advantage, the trade wheel and pulleys made one worker able to lift far more than his body weight. The Greeks were also the first to build practical water mills, systems that the Romans widely adopted to. Flowing water in a river turned a wheel connected by gears to grind grain into flour mostly. But the same system would be used later to mechanically saw wood. I also mention computational machines such as the Antikythera mechanism. These were very rare. They were high-technology devices that most people did not even know about. But what was more widely known were siege engines, catapults or ballistae, which were artillery pieces powered by torsion or tension. Beyond these practical inventions, you know that one theme in Greek thought, and the Romans adopted it, is an original view of how humans relate to nature. How nature could or should be tamed, exploited, turned into a resource that humankind uses to improve its quality of life, and progress always more, to demultiply its power over nature, with all the questions that it raises, morally, spiritually, and the danger for humans to exaggerate, go one step too far, and unleash retribution for having forgotten the limitations of their condition. In Greek antiquity, there was this idea that humans could exert power over nature thanks to know-how and technology. Even though they are not formalized or theorized as such, concepts like productivity, efficiency, large-scale exploitation are at play. More than any of their predecessors, the Greeks, and even more the Romans, mechanized, industrialized production. Roman mining is a good example of mechanization. In large mines, the Romans pumped up water with machines. They created lifting systems to increase production speed, and they did the same with construction, making them able to build faster and better. The belief that nature can be better exploited via technology and the development of all these machines go hand in hand. theory justifies action, and the results obtained with machines validate the theory. When we say that modern civilization, at least in Western cultures, inherited a lot from the Greco-Roman world, it isn't just legal systems, language, aesthetics, or elements of social organization. It is also a certain worldview. Of course, there were other influences. It would be an oversimplification to draw a direct line between this period of antiquity and our days as if it was the only matrix. But when it comes to this question of the power of humans over nature and the use of machines to rein it in, this counted. And cultures around the Mediterranean world and the Near East inherited this interest in mechanization. As a matter of fact, the development of various new machines went on across the Muslim world in the early medieval period. So, what were these new post-antiquity machines? First, practical windmills. It isn't clear when the very first windmills appeared, because the idea of using wind as a source of power is more ancient than that. For example, Heron of Alexandria, that we talked about before, described what appears to be a wind-driven wheel that could power a machine. But it is uncertain whether it was actually built. There were also wind prayer wheels in Tibet since an unknown date, possibly the 4th century AD. Prayer wheels are cylinders installed on a spindle. A prayer, a mantra, is written or engraved on the outside of the cylinder, and traditionally it is believed that spinning the wheel with the hand or letting the wind make it spin is an alternative to reciting the prayers. The first prayer wheels were driven by wind, and some historians have argued that the concept could have been inspired by Chinese revolving bookcases that were popular in Buddhist monasteries. So the idea of a wind power system is more ancient than that, but the real takeoff of practical windmills happened in Iran and Pakistan, where they multiplied from the 9th century AD. Contrary to the image of a windmill we have today, the first ones were horizontal, not vertical. They had a vertical axis, like a mast, with sails that rotated around it, like a carousel, and these mills served to grind grain or pump water. After conquering the Middle East and Central Asia, these windmills spread to Europe, India, and China in the 11th century. In Europe, they were first introduced in Spain via the Al-Andalus, the Muslim state that still covered much of Spain at the time, and in Greece. These horizontal windmills never fully disappeared, but in the 12th century, new vertical windmills started to be built further north, in a triangle of East England, Flanders, and northern France. It is unclear whether these windmills were inspired by horizontal windmills, or a separate invention, because this region of Western Europe already had many wheeled machines installed, especially watermills, in the 12th century. So this design of vertical windmills is the one that became more frequent in much of Europe, with its sails spinning vertically. This design remains the one of wind turbines for electricity nowadays. it has an efficiency edge against the horizontal design, because the blades or the sails move perpendicular to the wind. They produce greater force for a given flow of wind, as opposed to the horizontal design in which there is a drag from the wind on the returning sails every time the axis spins. On the other hand, their weakness is that they can be more fragile and less effective in turbulent wind. They also have to face the wind, so that means a more complex mechanism to angle the mill, depending on the direction of the wind. But in the plains of Western Europe, where winds were often rather steady, it was a better design. Another important type of machines that spread from the Middle East to Europe, but by the 13th century, is the spinning wheel. Now the place and time when it was invented is disputed between historians. Some place it in India, others in China, and others in the Middle East. A spinning wheel is a device used to make thread, yarn, from fibers. Before it, an important innovation for textile had been the cotton roller gin, a manual machine invented in India around the 6th century AD that quickly separates cotton fibers from cotton seeds. The fibers could be used for textiles, and the seeds to be replanted or used to produce oil. The roller gin improved productivity dramatically for something that was made by hand before. So the spinning wheel, which can be used for all kinds of fibers, cotton, flax, or wool, replaced hand spinning, which consisted in twisting fibers with the fingers to form yarn, even though early spinning wheels worked much better with wool. They would be perfected until the 19th century to become able to spin a larger variety of yarn. The spinning wheel kept evolving, and it became more mechanized, especially from the 18th century, with devices such as the spinning jenny. I'm going to tell you about the Industrial Revolution, and we will go back to this. Finally, another major innovation in the Muslim world, even though it didn't have immediate repercussions, were the first programmable machines. That is to say, machines that follow a set of instructions that control their behavior. And these were automata. One that was described in the 9th century was an automatic flute player. And in the 13th century, an inventor called Ismail al-Jazari created programmable automata, wonders of mechanical ingeniosity for the time, that would play music with different instruments, and the rhythms and patterns could be modified. By the late Middle Ages, mechanical clocks also multiplied across Europe. I told you about this in a past episode about the history of timekeeping, if you wish to know more about the different types of clocks. I told you before that this list of 6 simple machines was set during the Renaissance in the 16th century. So at this point, across Europe and the Middle East, machines were obviously not as widespread as today, but they had already become part of everyday life for almost everyone. From tools such as hammers, axes or saws, to spinning wheels, grinders operated by hand, by animals, wind or water, air blowers for metal workers, clocks, even church bells present in every village were generally activated by simple machines, pulleys and ropes. And a trend that had already begun, even though contemporaries did not necessarily perceive it, was the multiplication of ever more complex machines, something that would only accelerate with the Industrial Revolution. But we are not there yet. Until the 18th century, the machine remains more of a tool, an extension of the human body, that makes work easier or more productive. It is rarely the center of the productive activity. Manual labor, or the use of draft animals, remains the norm until the late 18th century. The 16th, 17th, 18th centuries are a period when inventors described or created new machines at an accelerated pace. An example of this is the production of concepts by Leonardo da Vinci. On top of his artistic and intellectual production, he conceptualized dozens of machines, most of which were never built. There were different flying machines, like the ornithopter, a machine with wings that a pilot would have manually flapped. It could never have worked, even with enormous and very light wings, because no human manual power would have ever allowed a pilot to lift its own weight. But it was creative. Or there was the aerial screw, a kind of conceptual ancestor to the modern helicopter, with a spiral that would have spinned fast to eject air downward and lifted the vehicle. Again, impossible without the engines that would be invented much later. He also imagined different war machines, like the organ gun, featuring rows of cannons that would fire sequentially, or the concept of armored tank, in this case a conical vehicle with guns all around, moved by hand cranks. Here again, very impractical without motors. It was just a concept. He also conceptualized automata, maybe a submarine. He is an extreme case of great imagination. But he also represents an age of individual inventors and engineers working on machines for all sorts of tasks, from improving clocks to bettering construction methods or improving productivity. These innovations did not necessarily produce immediate results, but the social drive behind them and the acceleration in technological improvement that it produced, this was preparing the Industrial Revolution, which can be considered the beginning of a new age for machines. One in which the machine is no longer just a curiosity, like automata, no longer just a way of making manual labor more productive, like cranes, tread wheels, or the spinning wheel, no longer just an element of comfort or convenience, like clocks, but rather the very center of manufacturing, something that more often than not humans set up, help working, or supervise, rather than doing the work themselves manually. That would be one of the biggest changes to the way we work brought by the Industrial Revolution. In the second half of the 18th century, different innovations in machines converged and mechanized production in various industries, starting with textile. And at the same time, a new revolutionary source of power was appearing with practical steam engines. So let's take a look at that, starting with the example of textile. Many new machines that would contribute to this revolution appeared in Great Britain. In 1733, there was the flying shuttle, which changed weaving. Until then, weaving was done manually on looms with a shuttle that the worker passed above and under each thread. The flying shuttle was still manual, but it doubled production speed by allowing a single weaver to move the shuttle back and forth on a track using a string. In 1764, there was the spinning jenny, a replacement for the already old spinning wheel that allowed one operator to spin multiple threads at once, up to 100. Still powered by hand at this point, but when this system would be powered by machines instead of manual labor, thread spinning would become entirely mechanical. And this happened in 1769 with the water frame, a spinning machine using water power, a mill, to spin threads, meaning it could now operate 24/7, and it was also better at making stronger threads, which allowed for the development of pure cotton threads. Prior to that, cotton and flax, linen, had to be mixed to get good enough thread. So the making of yarn was fully mechanized. And in 1785, there was the power loom, the first mechanized loom for weaving, that no longer needed manual labor, except to set it and supervise it. It could work first with water and then steam power. In 1793, the cotton gin, that mechanically separated cotton fibers and seeds. It reduced the time needed by over 50 times. Or in 1801, the Jacquard loom, a mechanized loom that used interchangeable punch cards, so a programmable loom, which allowed mass production of intricate fabrics with complex patterns and volume. These machines were perfected or replaced with others even more efficient along the 19th century, transforming the textile industry from handmade, which it had been since prehistory, to mechanized in a few decades. Even sewing, which was the most time-intensive part of clothing making, was revolutionized about at the same period by the sewing machine. The first practical design of sewing machine was invented in 1790. And in the 19th and 20th century, sewing machines made their way into factories and many homes. Maybe an even more transformative evolution happening at the same time was the introduction of steam engines, machines that use the force produced by steam pressure to push a piston back and forth inside a cylinder. It means there is a production of movement. A steam engine transforms heat obtained by burning fuel into movement, a movement that can be transmitted to another machine to make it work, to wheels in the case of locomotives, or to a propeller in the case of ships. The diffusion and improvement in steam engines, mostly powered by coal, not only provided a source of mechanical work that could power many devices, it also made humanity enter in an era that we could call the era of cheap energy. For thousands of years, there had been sources of power like wind or water streams, but these were not that common and limited to certain places. So the bulk of mechanical work for agriculture, food processing, the making of crafts or construction was animal and human power. Energy from these sources meant calories that had to be found, produced. And the total mechanical work available was limited by demography or the availability of draft animals. Steam engines marked the beginning of a capacity to harness unprecedented amounts of mechanical work, of energy. And we don't think much of it because that's the way we live. But compared to our ancestors, our lifestyles are incredibly energy intensive. Just an example, a quick car ride in an average car that weighs about 2 tons. This means moving 2 tons over several miles. The amount of force of work necessary for that alone is equivalent to several days of manual work of a person. Or just to cover the average electricity consumption of a home, someone would have to pedal on a bike with a dynamo 24/7. And I'm not even counting the mechanical work that went into all the stuff we own, or the food we eat. The average human today consumes a quantity of work, of mechanical work, that would have been unthinkable 3 or 4 centuries ago. And this revolution that made energy so abundant and cheap in comparison to the past, energy from different sources, hydrocarbons of course, but also hydroelectricity, nuclear, solar, wind. This revolution we owe entirely to the machines that harness it for us. Returning to steam engines, I told you earlier that one of the first ever steam turbines we know of was this Eolipile, designed by Heron of Alexandria, but it was not practical, it could not power anything. The first real, usable steam engine appeared in the 18th century, and from there they improved in power and efficiency regularly until the 1920s, when they started to decline against electric and internal combustion engines. Between the availability of constant and predictable mechanical work given by steam engines and the mechanization of almost every possible industry, production and labor changed dramatically. There are many dimensions to this, and it is another topic entirely. But think about what it means for the average manufacturing worker. These big factories that popped up in industrial countries in the 19th century began to take laborers out of their homes or their small workshops into large facilities where machines were installed. This is an example of people having to adapt to machines, not the other way around. The nature of work also began to change. Laborers were now working or facilitating or supervising the work of machines, which can still be physically demanding. They have to feed them raw materials or parts that the machine assembles, but it changes completely the nature of their work. Sometimes it can mean more know-how, as workers need to understand the machines optimize them, and it can make their work richer. But in many other cases, it also empties their work of know-how. They become pairs of arms that are interchangeable with all the consequences on income and the sense of self-worth that they get from their work. The concentration of many workers in the same places also means that the social reality of work also begins to change. They are going to organize, bound, new identities will emerge. This touches on the history of social changes and conflicts. The reality of this is nuanced and complex. At first it happens just in industrializing countries, the UK and a bit later on the European continent and America. And at the time a lot of different realities coexist. Large factories and mines become a thing, but there are also still a lot of smaller workshops, and a shrinking but still vast percentage of the population working in agriculture. And there are intellectual professions like teachers, health professionals, lawyers, or accountants that follow dynamics of their own. Still, the growing mechanization of work didn't go without opposition from some workers. Different movements appeared to try and fight it, unsuccessfully. An early example are the so-called Luddites in England, in the years 1810. We are just near the end of Napoleonic Wars. But in England at the time, the Industrial Revolution is well underway, and it is more visible in textile than any other large industry. The Luddites were textile workers who feared and opposed the multiplication of automated machinery in their industry, on the grounds that it would affect their pay, and in that they were probably right. It was killing their jobs as they knew them, and that it would also affect the quality of production, which is more debatable. But in any case, they felt threatened by automation. These textile machines invented in the second half of the 18th century that I told you about before, that were quickly spreading. Luddite, this name comes from the name of Ned Ludd, who was not a real person, but a legendary weaver. The participants in this movement adopted as a symbolic figurehead. So starting in 1811 in Nottingham, England, the movement was joined by more and more workers in other regions like Yorkshire and northwest England. Between 1811 and 1816, they protested and occasionally destroyed the machines. For that they were repressed violently, and eventually the movement was suppressed by force. Over time, the term Luddite has become a general word used to refer to people opposed to the introduction of new technologies, a term used most of the time by supporters of these technologies. It is a way to picture their opponents as opposed to change, anachronistic, and backward-looking or technologically illiterate. Of course, in retrospect, the transformation of the textile industry looks absolutely unavoidable, and indeed, the fight of the historical Luddites was probably a lost cause from the start. But sometimes people that have been called Luddites have the last laugh. For example, critics of NFTs or the metaverse were occasionally called Luddites. And look what these things have become today. At the same time, beyond work, lifestyles begin to change too, because in parallel, what the mechanization of production does is dramatically increase the production of goods and lower their cost. So manufactured goods progressively enter everyone's life, rich or poor, along the 19th and 20th centuries. Just an example, among others, is the rise of home electric appliances. Small, self-contained electric or gas-powered machines. There were already stoves in homes, using wood or coal. But starting in the early 20th century, devices intended for domestic use multiply, and it is something that emerged mostly in America, before spreading worldwide. Toasters, refrigerators, water heaters, washing machines, later dishwashers, electric kettles, hair dryers, microwave ovens. Even consumer electronics could be added to this universe of home appliances. Each of these devices is a machine designed to make daily life easier, more convenient, or more entertaining. And then again, with many consequences on our perception of life itself. The additional free time they give us and how we will use it. The access to home entertainment, which in the centuries prior was limited to books or publications, and socializing, card and board games maybe, but nothing more. Televisions, video games, music players, cell phones now. All of these are machine-based ways of entertaining oneself. That's another revolution in the way we live our lives if we allocate time to these things, but most of us do. This is what you're doing right now, actually. And yet another wave of new machines was about to surge in the 20th century. Programmable machines. Machines that can execute different tasks, not by changing them, but rather the set of instructions given to them. These had precursors. I told you of this first Middle Eastern automata of the medieval period, or the Jacquard loom with its punch cards in 1801. In the 19th century, there were a few attempts at mechanical computers. But the real takeoff was in the 1940s, thanks to electronics. In 1941, a German engineer and inventor, Konrad Zuse, assembled the Z3, an electromechanical computer that was programmable. Bigger and more powerful machines followed, like the ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, the first fully electronic digital computer that started being used in 1945, or the Manchester Baby in 1948, the first computer in which programs could be stored. As you know, and we will keep this for another episode, computers went through tremendous improvements in capabilities, while also shrinking in size and entering almost everyone's life along the past 50 years. With a flurry of inventions, both in hardware and software, from programming languages to interfaces. Programmable computers have been, and still are, tremendously useful for scientific research, statistics, the management of pretty much everything, easy access to information. They demultiply our capabilities, maybe more spectacularly than any other type of machines before. But again, more powerful and more complex machines redefine who and what we are and how we live. There are undeniable gains from them. Convenience, the automation of tasks that are repetitive and that most people would find unfulfilling. Improved health and longevity. Think about the power of MRI, CT scans, pacemakers, and many others. We don't want to lose these. But the outsourcing of part of our cognitive work, calculations, research, memory, this could mean we also end up losing in cognitive abilities or memory retention. The outsourcing to machines of tasks like surveillance may or may not affect our privacy. It also creates accountability issues. When automated systems make mistakes, where does the responsibility lie between conceptors, builders, those who maintain them, and users? And these are just a few examples. Machines create a whole set of new questions, legal, social, or touching on what makes us human now that AI is being deployed. I'm going to keep this set of questions for another upcoming episode, in which we will dive into the possible implications of modern technology, including AI. But for the moment, this concludes our episode for tonight. I'll be back soon with another one. And if you are not sleepy yet, you can always choose another episode in my library and embark on a new adventure. Or you may keep your eyes shut, let go, and fall asleep. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.